So thank you very much, everybody, for coming out, making it here despite the apocalyptic weather that we have outside. I understand that the city was in a sort of state of emergency due to the snowfall yesterday. I can definitely understand why, looking outside. So we have a very exciting program today. Before I go into the details on the agenda, I thought for the people in the room who aren't EGAP members that I could just take a few minutes to explain who we are and what the program here is all about. So EGAP stands for Evidence in Governance and Politics. I'm Cyrus Sammy. I'm the incoming executive director of EGAP, taking over last month. For Susan Hyde, who preceded me. EGAP it's a network of about 200 academics and practitioners based all over the world, working on issues pertaining to governance and focusing on intervention research. So many randomized control trials and field experiments and evaluation-based research that put a heavy emphasis on the use of experimental methods to test out various strategies to promote good governance, development, and other types of problems for which institutional type solutions might be useful. And so, this is our mission statement, written out in full in violation of every guideline for good slide practice, but I thought I'd put it up here to emphasize some core elements of our mission, which include, as it says here, generating and disseminating rigorous evidence on topics of governance, politics, and institutions. I mentioned that we're a network of about 200 academics and practitioners. Much of the research that's done by EGAP members, whether through initiatives that we fund or research that gets discussed at our meetings, is done in collaboration with academics collaborating with governments, with international organizations, with NGOs, with civil society organizations to test out intervention concepts. And so we do a lot of experimentation where we're basically working and trying to bring methodological insights to doing research in collaboration with these partners. I just thought I'd, mention some of the priorities that we're working on now. One of the priorities is to do more to link research and practice, and so this event today is an effort in that direction. So EGAP, the EGAP network is here in DC for a variety of activities. So we have this event today where what we're doing is having members of the EGAP network and also people affiliated presenting more polished research with the idea of communicating findings and also identifying directions for future research and trying to do this in communication with sort of the broader community of practitioners and policymakers and academics that we hope to engage as an audience. Other activities that we're doing here, so we've been having, members of the EGAP network have been having meetings with various agencies and offices in DC, including with USAID, with the World Bank. There was a meeting planned with OES this morning. Didn't take place, but that was part of an ongoing partnership that we have. And so the idea here is to use these opportunities when we all get together in one place to try and further build these bridges. And then tomorrow and Saturday, we have an EGAP meeting where members of the network are getting together to do sort of technical discussions of research designs and research either to be fielded or papers writing up research that we've done. So that's to give you an idea of the set of activities that are underway. We are a membership network that accepts applications for membership on sort of every other year almost. We have membership rounds. And so if what I'm talking about here interests you and you think that for your organization and for what you do, either as a researcher or as a practitioner, this might be interesting. Sort of keep in touch, keep referring to the website for membership rounds that come up, because we're looking to build out the network to include more practitioners and researchers. Other areas of focus is to develop research capacity in the Global South. So we have initiatives underway where we partner with academics and with practitioners who are based in the Global South, so largely in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa presently, to do training, methodological training. We run some of our meetings at institutions based in the Global South, and then also to invite researchers and practitioners based in organizations or universities in the Global South to become members to work with us as part of the EGAP network. And then the last two bullet points are pointing attention to work we do on methodology. So a lot of what EGAP's about is trying to promote sort of best practices methodologically for designing and fielding intervention studies. So research on experimental design, on measurement, and on inference. These are all things that we try and develop through our capacity building initiatives, and then also in the meetings. This is where a lot of the emphasis is placed when we're discussing research designs and studies. So that's what EGAP is all about. So now let me turn to today's events. So we're calling this a State of Evidence event, and so the idea here is to have panels that are going to present the results of some initiatives that have been undertaken by members of the EGAP network and people who are sort of affiliated with our broader community of practitioners and scholars. We have two sessions today. So the first session is on measuring the impacts of candidate debates. So this is a very interesting initiative spearheaded by the National Democratic Institute, and we have Linda Stern here to moderate for us, and then Matt Dipple from NDI, Eric Kramen from GW, and Pia Raffler from Harvard to present the results of research that they've done on candidate debates where the studies have been undertaken in developing countries. So the idea is to examine candidate debates as a strategy for promoting accountability in developing countries. Then we'll have a break for a half hour from 3:30 to 4 before we start up with session 2. So session 2 is focusing on how governance affects public service delivery, again, in developing countries. And Julianne Levon will moderate the panel, and we have contributions from Ken Apollo from Georgetown, Ghazala Mansouri from the World Bank, and Ana de la O from Yale, talking about various studies that they've undertaken, looking at how governance might affect or improve public service delivery in developing countries. So with that, I'll invite the first panel to come up. So I'll invite Linda, Matt, Eric, and Pia to come up. Linda, I can pass the microphone to you. Do you need some help with?
I don't need slides.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. So I'll just minimize this so that somehow. Okay. Great.
Thank you. Thank you, Cyrus, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Good to see everyone after our stormy winter day yesterday. As Cyrus said, I'm Linda Stern. I'm the Director of Evaluation at the National Democratic Institute, and I'm also a member of the EGAP Steering Committee for Elections, Representation, and Participation. And in both of those capacities, I'm very happy to convene and moderate this panel on measuring the impacts of debates, a conversation between practitioners and researchers. And so before I introduce our panel, let me tell you a little bit about, or give you a little bit of background about how this panel came about. First of all, NDI has been doing debates in their various forms since its inception in 1983. But it's only been in the last 10 years when we established a debates unit that we began to think a little bit more systematically about how we design and evaluate the impacts of our candidate debates programs. And in addition, over the last 5 or 6 years, I've seen a lot of really interesting research done by EGAP members on candidate debates. And so this panel is part of an effort to really start to look at the outcomes and impacts of debates for practitioners, not just on voters, but on the larger electoral system. So the panel is the start of a more purposeful dialogue between practitioners and researchers in which we'd like to try to answer 3 key questions. The first question is, how do we define candidate debates in the international democracy assistance arena? What do we currently know about debates and their effects from the research? And what are some promising areas for future research? Because this is still a growing evidence base. So the 3 panelists here will help us answer those questions. So we'll start off with Matt DePel. Let me just tell you a little bit about Matt. Matt is the Deputy Director of the Latin America and Caribbean team at NDI. And for more than 15 years, he has organized democracy strengthening programs on civil-military relations, political parties, civic organizations, and elections in more than 15 countries. Matt also serves as NDI's global advisor for candidate debate programs and is the liaison for projects around the world with the US-based Commission on Presidential Debates. He's also taken a leave of absence, not now, but in the past, to serve as the liaison for the commission with candidates for 16 US general elections, presidential and vice presidential debates. Before joining NDI, Matt served as Director of Research for the Shipbuilders Council of America, a trade association. He's also worked as a legislative assistant for Foreign Affairs and Healthcare for Representative Sid Morrison in the U.S. House of Representatives. And he received his master's degree in international relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and his undergraduate degree is from California State University, Long Beach. And today, Matt will talk to us about how we define candidate debates in the international democracy assistance sector. Next, we have Eric Raymond. Eric is an assistant professor of political science in international affairs at George Washington University. His research focuses on clientelism, ethnic politics, and electoral accountability in new democracies with a regional focus on sub-Saharan Africa. His work has received funding from the National Foundation of Science, the National Science Foundation, the International Growth Center, the Department for International Development, or DFID, and from EGAP itself for its Meta-Keta initiative. And he's published by or is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press, World Politics, Comparative Political Studies, the British Journal of Political Science, the Quarterly Journal of Political Science, and Perspectives on Politics. And Eric will present his findings today from research that he has done in Ghana on the presidential debates. And then lastly, we have Pia Raffler, Dr. Pia Raffler. She is an assistant professor in government at Harvard University, working at the intersection between political economy of development and comparative politics. Pia is interested in political accountability, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Her research focuses on oversight of bureaucrats and its implications for public service provision on the one hand, and on the other hand, electoral behavior. Her research has won Best Fieldwork Award and Best Dissertation Award in Experimental Research from the American Political Science Association. Pia has used experimental, quasi-experimental, and qualitative methods to measure causal effects and disentangle their underlying mechanisms. She holds a PhD in political science from Yale University and spent a year as a fellow at Princeton University. And she will present her research on the effects of candidate videos on voters in Uganda. After the presentations, we'll open up for a brief discussion with the panelists for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A for everyone. So with that, I will hand it over to Matt DePell.
Thank you very much, Linda. I appreciate the opportunity for this timely discussion from the practitioner side. We have a lot of anecdotal information and suppositions about the benefits of candidate debates, but have found very little systematic research into the impact of debates outside of the U.S. So the insights that would come from some grounded research would be key to truly assess and improve debate organizing efforts. I think to evaluate debates from a practical side, a first observation that I would make would be having the importance of a working definition of what a candidate debate is. So to start the discussion, I would take the liberty of sharing a definition such as it is based on lessons from NDI's involvement in helping partner groups organize more than 400 debates at all levels of elected office in 35 plus countries. This work is often done in partnership with the US-based Commission on Presidential Debates that Linda mentioned. That's the nonprofit that organizes the general election debates here in the US, most recently the Trump-Clinton debates in 2016. We also work with Debates International, which is a now nearly 40-country network of debate organizers from around the world that lend their assistance. So my sense is that a successful debate ideally has the following characteristics. It is a moderated, neutral, nonpartisan forum where candidates answer the same questions so citizens can compare the positions of the candidates. It's governed by mutually agreed upon rules, including specific time limits for fairness for when a candidate, how long they can speak. And candidates respond to follow-on questions or rebuttals and have some interaction among themselves. And I would stress the importance of having an agreed-upon definition for several reasons. The term debate is used pretty loosely around the world. In some countries, the concept doesn't translate well even from English. So it's good to have a good sense of what everybody's talking about. And some of the elements reflected in the definition can have a truly, I'd say, decisive impact on the effectiveness of debates, or even if something really is a debate, or if it might be what we would call a close cousin, less rigorous candidate forum. An example is the ability of a debate moderator or panelist to ask a follow-up question of a candidate. A follow-up question may take all of 15 seconds, but it can have a huge impact on the event. It can take it from a debate from being a series of candidate monologues that cause voters to turn the channel, or a solid kind of informative discussion that sharpens people's understandings of candidates' positions. For example, in the 2012 Mexican presidential debates, the moderator was prohibited from asking follow-on questions of candidates. It was under pressure from the parties, and the politicians didn't want to have that kind of flexibility. In 2018, the Mexican debate sponsor, the National Electoral Institute, realized that this approach was tanking with the voters, and they changed the rules and permitted follow-up questions by moderators. So this change, among others, led to I'd say a tenfold increase, tenfold spike in the debate audience. So they went from 1.5 million in 2012 to about 18 million in 2018. So even a little change, and that's why I think it's so important to focus on the definition. In terms of possible lines of inquiry for evaluating debates, I would highlight a number of ways that activists who have organized debates have found them to be anecdotally beneficial. And I would note at the outset that we're seeing a lot of countries finding value in debates. So far, by our count, or the Debates International count, at least 90 countries. I think it's a lot higher than that. And it's striking the disparate cultures, languages, geography, but they've all found common cause in debates. Summing it up, I'd say the interest is based on 5 types of benefits from debates that really make it more than a 2-hour event. The first would be that debates help to inform voters and compare candidates. They're generally the only time you'll see candidates together at the same place, side by side during an election campaign. There's a former U.S. moderator and TV host, Charlie Gibson, that said, debates are like the ultimate job interview. And I think that's a good way to look at it. A Ghanaian debate organizer we've worked with said that debates helped his country go from, quote, the politics of insults to the politics of issues. And I think this is because debates force candidates to focus on issues rather than ethnic or regional loyalties. Debates make it hard to get by with a stump speech or platitudes when you're up there duking it out for a couple hours. You're also standing with a moderator or your opponent, so they're going to call you on things. They're going to call a candidate and challenge any assertions you make. So some anecdotal results in this respect. In Haiti in 2016, 92% of people tuned into presidential debates. And that was a serious commitment. There were 5 presidential debates, which encompassed 33 of 54 presidential candidates. There's a lot of debating. In Malawi, NDI conducted focus groups following the 2014 elections and the country's first ever presidential debates. Voters said the elections that year were more substantive, more focused on issues that mattered to them personally, and they saw fewer personal attacks. And they also said more specifically that debates provided a side-by-side comparison of candidates. They changed or reinforced their voting choices and gave them motivation to vote. And post-debate polling in Jamaica has found something similar. 70% of viewers said debates helped clarify their candidates' positions. A second benefit of debates are they help reduce political tensions and the potential for election violence in countries coming out of civil war or that are politically or ethnically polarized. So debates lower tensions. They show opponents on a national stage treating each other with mutual respect, even if they disagree on issues. And it's the only time in a campaign where opposing candidates have to sit down and negotiate debate terms. And as I mentioned, I work in the U.S. debates. That's part of my role, is to mediate between the campaigns. And I can say that's a pretty big achievement, to have candidates that are in the middle of a hard-fought election to sit down and work on terms. Debates also send a really powerful image of national unity when you have candidates together on a stage shaking hands, or depending on the cultural context, there's the occasional hug. And this image usually generally ends up on the front page of newspapers the next day. There's a famous shot from Malawi, for example, where they had 11 candidates all holding locked arms on stage that was first and foremost in the media. Debates also provide an opportunity for candidates to commit to resolve any election conflicts they may have in the courts rather than sending their people to the streets. Now, it's no guarantee that when a candidate says publicly during debate that they're going to follow the rules or they're going to use the legal system, but it's a first step, and if they don't, then the public can hold them accountable for their actions. In terms of conflict, there was a great quote I remember from a Liberian presidential candidate who said, he stopped in the middle of the debate and he said, the greatest thing about this debate is to see Liberian presidential candidates sitting here and talking to each other and trying to convince voters rather than being in the bush and shooting at each other. So in that respect, debates stand in contrast to campaign rallies where candidates tend to use more aggressive, less substantive rhetoric and throw red meat to their kind of diehard supporters. In that respect, in Indonesia a few years ago, election authorities proposed to ban campaign rallies, arguing that these promoted conflict, and instead they wanted to substitute them with debates, which they said helped people learn more about their candidates' positions. A third benefit of debates, they force candidates to go on record. So the media, civic watchdog groups can hold candidates accountable by contrasting their campaign promises with the actions that happen even years later. And I've seen lots of examples of that. You can see it quite frequently in the US. Even now, people refer back to the 2016 debates. I've seen it in Argentina, Colombia, Iran, Philippines. So it's a way to hold candidates accountable. Even some countries, they're doing, I guess, what I call a post-accountability debate. So after a candidate's elected, they hold another debate, maybe a year later, with the opposition candidates, and they see if they've stuck to their promises. Debates also cross borders. So when a debate happens in one country, others watch it and ask, why can't we do the same thing? So it sends this kind of message. It promotes a demand for debates elsewhere. It also is kind of a sign that your democracy is healthy and maturing. In that respect, debates in Ghana have spurred interest in debates from other West African countries. Jamaica has had the same impact in the Caribbean. Countries like Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago also wanted debates after they saw what happened in Jamaica. And I think a fifth and final benefit, I would say, is that debates help level the playing field in countries where one party dominates the political environment and the media. So they provide candidates with access to media exposure to get their message out to voters, even in closed environments. I think anecdotal evidence in countries like Cambodia have shown that they can help opposition candidates even win elections because they can get word to voters. I think I'll stop there and save the rest for Q&A.
That's not mine. Oh, no, you've seen too far ahead. Okay. All right, well, thanks very much for inviting me to speak and for organizing this event. Thanks, Linda and Matt and Pia for being involved. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the research I've done on debates in Ghana. This is collaborative work with Sarah Brierley and Georgia Fosu, who are both at the Washington University in St. Louis. So just to give you a sense for the kinds of questions we were hoping to answer in this research, we really had two general guiding questions that we wanted to address that we think speak to important issues surrounding the role that debates might play in the democratic process. So the first is a very simple one. How do debates impact voters? And in particular, we were very interested in the question of whether debates reduce or potentially amplify partisan polarization and divisions in the electorate. So we wanted to know, do debates kind of make people more open or favorable toward candidates from maybe outside of their ethnic group or outside of their partisan group? Or does it just kind of reinforce people's kind of prior partisanship? I should say we planned this study in the heat of the 2016 election here in the US. And so we were watching the debates here as we were planning this study there. That made us a little bit skeptical about the reductions of partisan polarization hypothesis, but there's good news that's going to come in a few slides on that point. But I should say, to some extent, our own experience sitting here in the US is guiding some of the motivation for the study here. The second set of questions that we were interested in is this question of why debates would impact voters. So Matt talked a lot about kind of what debates are, and it should be clear to anyone who's seen one that debates have a lot going on in them. So it's true that there is policy-centered content, So it's possible that debates are influential because voters are exposed to policy-centered debates and they learn about policy positions. Maybe they're persuaded by policy arguments. They can also learn other types of information about candidates. Debates are performance, right? So they might find out that someone is likable, they seem trustworthy, they might learn about their background, their experience. So this is what we refer to in the paper as quality. They just kind of learn, like, is this person appear to be a competent or likable kind of candidate? And then there's a third category of potential reasons that debates would be influential that might kind of fall outside of the bin of something that we would think from a normative perspective would be useful for voters, right? Maybe things like the physical attractiveness of candidates, candidate charisma. Before I came here, I was looking at this website that documented like the most famous gaffes in debate history, right? And it's all this stuff like Al Gore sighing while George Bush is talking, right? So that would kind of fall into this space. That is not policy-related content, but it does have a big effect potentially on how people kind of process what's going on in debates. It certainly can dominate what the news media says about them. So we were curious whether these dynamics mattered as well. Okay, so Matt laid out, I think, really, really helpfully many of the reasons why debates are different from other types of campaign events that you often see in a place like Ghana, in particular campaign rallies. So I'll just dive kind of straight into what we did in this study. So to provide a little bit of context, which should be helpful for understanding the results. We worked during Ghana's 2016 parliamentary elections. Ghana's been holding regular elections every 4 years since 1992 when they made the return to multi-party competitive elections. These elections are concurrent with presidential elections, and they typically have presidential debates as well, as Matt mentioned. Ghana has a very strong two-party system, which is going to become important for the research. At the time, the incumbent was the National Democratic Congress, the NDC. The opposition was the New Patriotic Party. Ghana is a place where partisan identification can be very, very strong. All right, so there are people who, I'm an NDC person, I'm an MPP person. There are swing voters, but partisanship really does matter to many people in Ghana. So in that sense, it's not too dissimilar from what we observe here in the US with people strongly identifying with a Democrat or a Republican, sorry. This makes Ghana unique compared to maybe some other countries in the region where partisanship is a lot more fluid. Ghana is typically considered a stable democracy, kind of one of the more democratic countries in the region. That being said, elections are often characterized by vote buying, ethnic mobilization. The organizations that organized the debates were very concerned about kind of a lack of policy-centered, issue-based campaigning, and the hope was that the debates would help to mobilize or jumpstart that. So we worked, as I said, around parliamentary debates. Ghana has 275 single-member district constituencies, so these are kind of similar to our congressional districts here in the US. The debates that we look at in the study were organized jointly by two organizations. The first is the Center for Democratic Development, CDD, which is a non-governmental organization. CDD is one of the more prominent democracy promotion organizations in Ghana. In fact, they play an active role in actually training other civic organizations around the region. So they're very experienced with this sort of stuff. The debates were also coordinated by the National Commission for Civic Education, which is a governmental organization. It is an explicitly nonpartisan organization. Their goal is basically to facilitate, as the name implies, voter education, political participation. It's worth emphasizing that this commission is typically seen and understood to be pretty nonpartisan. And the involvement of the NCCE turned out to be quite important for convincing all the candidates to participate, especially incumbents who could say, oh, I'm busy, I've got stuff to do. The NCC has a lot of clout in the system, and they played an important role in making sure all the candidates showed up, which, as we might talk about later, is a very important dimension to debates organization. Many times incumbents don't want to show up. In 2016, this was, I believe, the first year they did legislative or parliamentary debates. Ghana had held presidential debates, I think, for the first time in 2012. They did hold presidential debates again in 2016. And the goal of this program was to extend this into the parliamentary space. The debates were organized typically in a central location in the constituencies. They would usually invite local civil society, traditional leadership, local party activists or representatives from the main political parties. And then there was a dissemination strategy mainly centered on broadcasting on radio and trying to cover in local newspapers. Okay, so in the constituencies where we work, the debates had a very specific format, which to some extent facilitated the research, as I'll mention in a minute. So each candidate was given 2 minutes to basically discuss their background, so their qualifications, their values, their connections to the constituency. I'll show you what some of this looks like in a second. Then the organizations decided that in the study areas, they really wanted to focus on issues related to education and unemployment. So there were 2 rounds of kind of 2-minute segments with debates around proposals for what they're going to do to improve unemployment issues in the constituency or promote education in the constituency. Third was question and answer with the audience, which in some cases lasted many hours and was quite vibrant and interesting, but also very long. So the candidates had a lot of endurance. So in the area where we studied, the candidates were given the choice to speak in whatever language they wanted. Most of the folks spoke in Fanti in the areas where we were working, though some of them went into English a little bit. Okay, so one of the most interesting things about this study actually was just listening to the debates and reading the transcripts. You actually learn a lot about the local politics of these constituencies just by seeing what types of issues the candidates emphasize and what they think voters want to hear. So I wanted to give a little bit of flavor of the types of things that came out in these segments. In many ways, the background segment was one of the more interesting. So one of the most important things that basically every candidate did in this segment was emphasize their local credentials and their local connections to the constituency, often very explicitly kind of laying out, where people in their family were from, where they grew up, the types of kind of organizations that they've been a part of. This is a big component to this. They often talked a lot about their values and motivations. So why are they getting into politics? What is driving them? Why are they up here? So many of them emphasize that, which is very interesting. And then a number of them also kind of got into the nitty-gritty details of their qualifications, often trying to one-up other candidates that were next to them on stage. So they would talk about their experience in government. They would talk about the various degrees that they had. A number of them talked in a lot of detail about the community or civic organizations that they were a part of or had been involved with. In terms of policy, the education debates in this election were largely centered around one key issue. The opposition, the main opposition party, the MPP, one of the main pillars of their platform was free secondary education. So Ghana's had free primary since probably the mid-90s, I think. Now there's many school leavers kind of leaving primary school, and not everyone can afford to go to secondary school, or there are not enough spaces. And so a major campaign pledge of the MPP has been free secondary education. Somewhat interestingly, the incumbent basically said, no, that's not a fiscally responsible policy position. And moreover, there aren't enough schools for people to go to. So we are going to focus on infrastructure development, and then we will move to free secondary. So most of the debates, or in our study areas, they went back and forth on this issue in some detail, which was really interesting. In the unemployment space, they also tried to strike some differences. Again, the opposition party was running on a one district, one factory platform. So their idea was they're going to have a factory for everyone to work in, and well, not everyone, but some people in the district to work in. The incumbent focused a lot on infrastructure development. We worked in the southern part of Ghana, which is a port or area along the coast. So they talked a bit about modernizing the port. And basically all candidates talked a lot about skills training for youth and how to get youth into employment. All right, so just to kind of show some photos of the debates, here's on the left, kind of what the debates looked like in a Futu constituency, which is a slightly more urban constituency. KEA on the right is slightly more rural, so that one took place outside. And here's some of the candidates talking. The guy in the upper right corner is actually interesting. He's the former president's brother, so he mentioned that a few times. Okay, so I want to give a quick rundown of the research design before showing you just a few of the main results. So we worked in 3 constituencies in Ghana's central region. We chose these places because in some sense they're kind of microcosm of Ghanaian politics. They have communities that are very strong MPP communities. They have communities that are very strong NDC communities. And they have kind of mixed, what you might think of as swing, or at least partisan heterogeneous communities. So we sampled 12 electoral areas, which basically to think of as a community, in each of those regions. We chose, in each place, we chose 6 competitive places. And then 6 places that, based off past voting records, were known to be very strong NDC or MPP communities. And then within communities, we randomly assigned individual voters or individual potential voters to one of 5 treatment conditions. And these conditions were designed to speak to the questions that I mentioned on the first slide, mainly focused on this question of why debates matter. So we had some folks in control, so they're not seeing a debate. They saw a non-political comedy video. One of the big questions, as I said, that we're interested in is this question of whether policy debate matters more than the other kind of things that people might learn. So we had some people in the study only watching the background segment. We had some people in the study only watching the policy segments. So if we want to know, does policy-centered debate matter more than kind of the other types of things that are going on in debates, we can compare the effect of the policy segment versus the effect of the background segment. If the policy segment has a much bigger effect, then we can kind of infer, okay, maybe the policy content is doing something important here. On the right, we have people who saw the full debate, so both segments, and then people who heard the full debate. And there were kind of 2 motivations to this tweak. One was to try to get at some of these questions about visual performance. So you can't kind of see who's more visually charismatic if you're listening to it, right? So if the effect of the full video is much bigger than the effect of the full audio, maybe we can make some inferences about the importance of visuals. We also wanted to do this because many dissemination strategies involve both television and radio. In a place like Ghana, more people have access to the radio than have access to television. So we thought it would be worth, from a kind of programmatic or policies perspective, to know which one of those, or if it mattered, how people engage with the debates. So we have basically 3 measurement strategies. So first, we survey people right after they saw the debates. Then we survey them 48 hours later. We also did something that turned out to be really fun, which was real-time response on tablets. So if you've ever seen, like, when you're watching a debate or something on CNN, and there's a little worm going on along the bottom where people are pressing buttons, like I like what they're saying here, or I don't like what they're saying here, and it's kind of, you can see the real-time focus group results coming in. This is what we had people doing in one of our study constituencies. So this is basically the interface. They're instructed to basically press the plus sign if they like what they're hearing or it's making them want to support the candidate, negative sign if they're not liking it, and then neutral, they don't do anything. The data this generated was really interesting. You don't have to decipher this, but the main point is that we can actually show like minute by minute. So this is minute by minute. We can show how people are reacting to very, very specific things that the candidates are saying. Just to give an example, the top row there are people who are strong supporters of the MPP. So you can see they're going along, and then when the NDC candidate starts doing their background spiel, it goes way down. And then when the MPP candidate starts doing their background spiel, it goes way up, and it's the opposite for the NDC partisans. Okay, so, but that actually tempers out in the policy segments, which is interesting. But so we do some work with this in the study. Okay, so I just want to show a few of the main results that came out of this, mainly focused on questions about effects on swing versus partisan voters. So what I'll be showing you here are the treatment effects, so the comparison between treatment and control. The first is on a 1 to 7 evaluation of the candidates. So this is the effect among swing voters, which we can't statistically distinguish from 0. The most interesting effect is the next one, which is the effect of strong partisans evaluating candidates from other parties, including the other major party. Okay, and here we see that there is a kind of significant positive increase. So if I'm a strong MPP supporter, I become more favorable toward NDC candidates and minor party candidates. And then we find a small but not kind of distinguishable from 0 negative effect on evaluations of co-partisans. So if I'm an MPP person, I become a little less supportive of my preferred party. We find similar results on intended vote choice. So here we see that people become more likely to want to vote for kind of out-party candidates and substantially less likely to want to vote for the person in their preferred party as they reported previously. So maybe they were kind of disappointed in the performance of their person and maybe pleasantly surprised by people outside of their partisan group. Okay, so to kind of summarize those two slides, this is some evidence of partisan moderation, which, coming from 2016 in the US was very nice for us to see. The debates made strong partisans more favorable toward out-party members, less likely to say they would want to vote for their co-partisans, and more open to voting for people from outside their party. Then we wanted to know what it was about the debates that is driving that moderation effect. So is it policy? Is it other stuff? And so here I'm showing you the effect of, well, basically the moderation effect. So when people are evaluating out-party candidates. And the left is the effect of the background segment, and the right is the effect of the policy segment. So you can see that both of them do have a positive effect. So there's something about the background kind of likability dimension that is influential here. But the policy effect is quite a bit bigger, which suggests that the policy component might be more influential. Similarly, on intended vote choice, the background has a smaller effect, and here it's not distinguishable from 0, whereas the policy segments does have an effect. So it seems like both dimensions matter, but the policy-specific component seems to matter more. You can see this a little bit also in the real-time response data. I think I'm running out of time, so I can't go into too much detail about this, but you're seeing kind of aggregate responses among NDC partisans on the left and MPP partisans on the right when they're hitting the buttons plus and minus for NDC candidates, which are the solid lines, and MPP candidates, which are the dotted lines. And the main takeaway here, so the background segment is on the left, and then the policy segments are the second and the third. The main takeaway is that you see a lot of partisan polarization in the personal background section. Basically, people are hitting like plus, minus pretty vigorously for or against in or out group politicians in the background segment. But this gets tempered a lot and diminishes quite a bit in the policy segments. Okay, last thing I want to mention is that we did go back and re-interview folks later, or 2 days later. And we found some kind of interesting local variation in the extent to which these effects persist. So again, these are the moderation, the kind of partisan moderation effects that I showed before. You'll remember that we worked in competitive communities and in party stronghold communities. And we find evidence of this moderation in both types of communities immediately after the debate viewing. But it is only in the competitive places that we see that the partisan moderation sticks. In the party stronghold communities, which is the far right, the effect that was right there before, it goes to zero. Okay, so it looks like there's something about the partisan composition of the local community that matters a lot in terms of the effect of the debate kind of sticking and persisting beyond the immediate effects. And to some extent, this is very consistent with literature on campaign advertising in the US, which suggests like fairly immediate effects and then decay over time. Okay. So to summarize, we found some evidence that the debates led to moderation and reductions in partisan polarization. The evidence suggests that the policy components of the debates played a role in driving this moderation. And we found some evidence that the local, very, very local political environment appears to condition the durability of these effects. And I guess I'll end by saying that in terms of directions of future research, this last result would be, I think, a very important one for us to try to tease out exactly why we found that pattern. I think I'll end there.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, great, here we go. Great, thank you for having me. My name is Pia Raffler. I'm going to present joint work with my colleague Melina Platas, who's at NYU Abu Dhabi, from Uganda. So this project is called Meet the Candidates, precisely because it's not quite a debate, but we're going to show voters videos of candidates that it meets all the criteria of a debate, but it doesn't involve the back and forth. And we should talk about later on sort of whether that matters and how it might matter. And so what we're moving here is from attitudes to voting behavior. And so we all know that information does not always lead to behavior change. Here's a nice example on the scientific workout from the New York Times. I don't know how many of you have done it. I have not recently. So behavior change is hard, right? There's a lot of good information out here, but that does not mean that we're actually going to affect people's behavior. And so what we're interested in here is what is the role of information provided in the form of candidate videos on vote choice. In particular, we're interested in the conditions under which this type of information induces voters to cross party lines. Why are we interested in this? As I'll go into in a bit more detail in a moment, is we're working in Uganda, which is has a very strong dominant ruling party, so we're working in a very unlevel playing field, and we're so precisely interested in one of the points that Matt raised earlier on is debates can actually play a role in leveling the playing field and really sort of favoring the opposition to Nixon. So to look at this systematically, we conducted sort of a set of nested field experiments in both the 2015 intra-party primaries of the ruling party in Uganda as well as the 2016 inter-party general elections for parliament. So in sort of over the course of the study, we wound up filming nearly 100 candidates across 11 constituencies, and then sort of constructed from these videos, so from the filming of candidates, we then constructed videos, which we then screened to nearly 30,000 voters across 240 polling station catchment areas. So you see an example of one of these debate screenings. So we basically did a village roadshow in which we took these videos, which provided information on all the candidates in a race, to often very, very remote villages. And so let's just say we had no problem with turnout, in part because this was the first time in a lot of these places where sort of moving images were being brought to villages. So there was a lot of excitement, there was a lot of interest, but there was also a lot of substantive excitement in this. So let me preview the results real quick before going into more details of the study. So first of all, we find that voters learned from these videos, watching these videos. After watching them in the treatment areas, voters tend to be more informed about candidates, in particular about opposition candidates. We also find that, so we code up whether sort of we measured voters' expectations before watching any videos, before being exposed to our intervention, about each and every candidate along a number of dimensions. And so from that, we can actually construct a measure, and then we interview them again after watching the videos. And we also have experts watching the videos and coding each candidate's performance. And from that, we can code up whether a voter sort of exceeded expectations or underperformed. And so from that, we can create a measure and say, okay, sort of we know from the baseline survey which candidate a given voter was planning on voting for. And so then we can construct, well, okay, sort of did this candidate actually do quite well and exceeded expectations or not? And so from that, we can then see, okay, so in those cases where the preferred candidates didn't do so well, what actually happened to turnout? And we find that it marginally depresses turnout by about 3.8 percentage points. We also find that, yes, indeed, providing this information induced voters to switch their vote choice. So they moved away from the candidate they had intended to vote for at baseline and instead voted for someone else. These effects were very similar across the two types of elections, the primaries and the general elections. But interestingly, in the general elections, we really see a lot of switching away from the ruling party. So in the general elections, the treatment effects are really concentrated among the voters who had been planning on voting for the ruling party candidate. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that might be. So when we talk about information, providing candidate information, right, it all seems so simple. We have voters need to choose between different candidates, they get some kind of noisy signal about how well they're performing, or can be expected to perform, how qualified they are, how good their policy positions are. And on this basis, they sort of evaluate them and decide whom to vote for or whether or not to re-elect the incumbent, right? Now, in practice, this is really so much more complicated, in part because oftentimes voters just don't have very good information about the incumbent's performance. Also because, even more so, they might not have good information about the challengers, right? The incumbent, at least you have a track record, but for a lot of times for the challengers, it's a lot harder to predict how they would perform, right? We're talking about a counterfactual here. But these are complications, of course, are exacerbated in low-income countries where voters tend to be of lower education levels, and we oftentimes don't have a good media that would be providing this information. So a lot of solutions to this problem are, right, to sort of provide voters with sort of information about the candidate performance, often in the form of scorecards, and then oftentimes that's benchmarked against the performance of other candidates in other regions. And so what we chose to do here is a little bit different, and I want to tell you why we chose to do something different. And so first of all, we thought, well, voters really don't just decide whether or not to vote for the incumbent or not. What they really have to choose is whom from the battery of candidates to select, right? So if we want to help voters make a good decision, we really need to give them information about all the different candidates. In particular, for the reasons I just outlined, it might be especially important to give them information about the challengers rather than the incumbent. But of course, what that means is if you're including the challengers, you can't just talk about sort of their past performance and their track record while being in office, because there isn't one, oftentimes, right? So necessarily this is more about qualifications and about sort of, policy promises and policy platforms. And the other thing that we learned from some existing studies is that it's really, really important to involve the candidates and the parties from the get-go when thinking about implementing such an intervention and study, because some of the existing studies sort of were hampered by the fact that candidates just didn't like them. Right? They felt like, there are these scorecards that are being disseminated about us, and we're not getting a fair shake, or it's not going to help us. And then sort of very purposefully, especially in Uganda, sort of worked against that. And so we wanted to circumvent that. And so from the get-go, we worked very closely with the Electoral Commission, with civil society organizations, and with the parties in designing this intervention to find something that, of course, also in the hopes that this would eventually be scalable. And for that, it's got to be popular. So as mentioned, we're working in Uganda, small landlocked country in East Africa that you've probably read a lot of studies about. So Uganda is, sort of what's important to consider here is that Uganda has been ruled by one party, the National Resistance Movement, since 1986. There's never been a peaceful transition of power. And this party controls about 70% of seats at all levels of government. It's a decentralized government system, including parliament, which is the level that we're focusing on. And there are a couple of opposition parties, but multi-party elections were really only introduced in 2005. So even though these opposition parties have been around for quite a long time, they're not terribly well organized and not always terribly well known. And the ruling party really has the upper hand. It's a very slated playing field. And unfortunately, this is increasingly so. So what you see here is the police. So as one journalist put it, the chief of the police had this brilliant idea in the last election, 2016, that we worked in, of using police resources to mobilize for the NRM, for the ruling party, and demobilizing opposition supporters. So there's a real conflation between the state institutions, i.e. the police and others, and the ruling party. And so in this environment, we're introducing an intervention where we're bringing, at least in the general elections, candidates from all parties to a TV studio in Kampala. We couldn't get them all on the same stage for a number of reasons I can get into. And so we brought them into a TV studio in Kampala, and they each sort of answered a set of 6 questions, 3 on background, 3 on policy platforms. It was cut in such a way and edited in such a way that everybody had exactly the same amount of time. And then it was sort of cut in such a way that you always see the question, which was asked by a professional moderator in the local languages, and then the response by each candidate in turn, and then you move on to the next question so that it can really draw the comparison across the different candidates. The sort of image questions, background questions relate to sort of their personal background, their characteristics, their qualifications, their past performance in related jobs. And then for policy, we selected 3 sort of controversial policy areas at the time. What was the priority area for their constituency? What was the priority sector? What was their position on district creation? So there's rapid administrative unit proliferation in Uganda. And then sort of how they, sort of their position on a proposed 5-year ban on running for office if one was caught engaging in vote buying. And then we took these videos again, sort of, and screened them in randomly selected polling station catchment areas. A lot of them, as you can see here, very, very rural. And we had very good turnout, so usually about 100 to 200 people showed up and really seemed to be extremely interested in the debates. Now, this was really a team effort. This was not just Melina and me, right? There were a lot more people involved here. This is a joint project with a number of civil society organizations from Uganda, including the Agency for Transformation and the Africa Institute. Macquarie Department for Political Science partnered with us, Wizards Media, a professional media and TV organization, and then Innovations for Poverty Action was our research partner, funding from EGAP, IRI, and FES. Thank you. And then we had the support of the Electoral Commission, political parties, candidates, and importantly, voters, right, who gave us their time. So we worked in 11 constituencies and sort of spread across the country. You can disregard so it's the dark blue and the orange. The light blue is water. And we purposefully selected relatively competitive constituencies because the playing field is so slated in Uganda that we felt if we were going to go to strongholds of the NRM, it just wouldn't do anything. I don't know. It would be interesting, but that's the decision we made. So So in terms of the research design, just very quickly, so in total we worked in over 500 polling stations, but for purposes here today, it's really, what's important is so we have 480 polling stations. We randomly assigned polling stations to be part of the primaries 2015 field experiments or the general election 2016 experiment, and then within those randomly assigned them to treatment control. And those are the comparisons that I'm going to show you, sometimes pooled and sometimes by election round. So in the treatment group, we had a baseline survey, face-to-face, which was then followed by the public screening of the debate video. We incentivized our sampled respondents, 20 per polling station, to actually attend the debate screening. We then had a posterior survey, again face-to-face within 24 hours in the treatment group, where we gathered their reactions. Then the election took place about 4 to 6 weeks later. And then after the election, the evening of and the following 2 days, we did a phone-based exit poll, all this with about 9,000 voters. And in the control group, of course, we only have the baseline survey, the election, and the exit poll. So the outcome data that I'm going to focus on is from this exit poll, where we have a surprisingly high response rate. We had very good tracking, 85% responded. And importantly, sort of turnout is socially desirable, right? So one important consideration here is, well, if voters tell us, or citizens tell us they voted, should we believe them? That's not clear, right? I would actually argue probably not. And so we had to come up with something that meant that we could actually sort of trust their response here. And so we came up with 2 verification questions. One was in the primaries, we asked them whether these were handwritten or pre-printed ballots. And then we also asked a little trick question. We asked them, well, did the candidate wear a suit in the photo? But there were no photos on the ballot. And so you should really know that if you actually voted, right? And indeed, 85% got it correct. And in the general elections, we took advantage of the fact this is the first time that they use biometric machines. So we asked them which finger was used in the biometric machine. And again, around 80% get it correct. And these figures rhyme very nicely. Once we correct for verification, these figures rhyme very nicely with the official turnout. So we have a lot of confidence in these. OK, so let me show you some results. First of all, on candidate knowledge. So this is, did people actually learn something from watching these debates? Then I'll also focus on turnout, verified through these measures that I just discussed. Then I'll talk a little bit about vote switching. So did people switch away from the person they had identified whom they wanted to vote for at baseline? Yeah, and I'll stop there. One quick side note that I want to make here is that for any of these kinds of studies, ethical considerations are incredibly important, right? Because here we are walking around studying the elections of other countries and sort of intervening, even if with cooperation of the government, but still we're intervening in elections, right? So we got to be very, very careful in how we do this. And we're collecting a lot of very sensitive data on how people voted. So we have to make sure we protect that data very carefully, right? And so what we did is we went sort of above and beyond a little bit and so just sort of tried to create a lot of buy-in and input from local and state actors, including the secretaries of the political parties, the National Electoral Commission. We had the partner organizations. We got all the ethics approvals one can possibly get and all the police approvals one can possibly get, which we wound up needing, and I'm happy to tell more about sort of the logistics side of things, because it was a very tight election and sort of very tight security. It wasn't a good atmosphere. And then, of course, we had to make sure that it was very unlikely that we would affect the outcomes of the election, right? So we only treated a very small share of voters in each constituency. So even if we had had massive treatment effects, we still wouldn't have affected the outcomes. And then, of course, there were elaborate efforts to make sure that to keep the data and the field team safe. OK, so first of all, what we find from our baseline survey is that voters do indeed know a lot more about the candidates of the ruling party, which you see in yellow here, the NRM, than opposition or independent candidates. So the informational playing field is extremely slanted. And then, so I know Eric already showed some coefficient plots, but I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page here very quick. Right? So coefficient plots, this is our 0 line here in the middle. Anything that's sort of to the right or to the top, depending on how the graph is tilted, is a significant positive treatment effect. Anything that crosses the 0 line, we can't distinguish from 0, and anything that's to the left or below is a negative treatment effect. OK, good. So first of all, we wanted to know what actually predicts the vote choice, right? Because we have a nice setup here where we know how people voted or how they report they voted. And we also asked them 6 to 8 weeks before sort of their evaluation of each of the candidates, so we can actually see sort of what are the predictors of vote choice. And what we see is really the perceived candidate quality that plays a very important role here. So what we see here is a bunch of, on the top panel, you see a bunch of sort of correlates of sort of, sort of what we often think of sort of clientelism and co-ethnicity. So do you expect this person to help you? Are they your co-ethnic? Do you expect them to be engaged in vote buying? Do you expect them to engage in corruption? And we don't see much action there. That doesn't track with whom voters vote for. Sort of then the next panel are indicators that relate to quality, essentially. Sort of, do you think this person will represent their party well? Do you expect them to get access to government resources to bring to your village? Do you expect them to work hard? And sort of what's your rating on their character and their competence? And all those are strong predictors of vote choice. And then not so much on policy. So things on do they align in terms of their policy preferences, we don't necessarily see strong prediction here. But I just wanted to throw this out here because we oftentimes think about African voters as only voting on the basis of ethnicity or clientelism, and this does not support this, right? Okay, now finally some results. So first of all, we do see that voters become more informed. So voters in our treatment group at the exit poll and the end-line survey, we asked a couple of factual knowledge questions, and indeed, they're more likely to be able to name a greater share of names of the candidates that are running and their policy positions on priority sectors. And this is true for both the general election and the primaries. We then see, sort of, as mentioned already, sort of we coded up whether they received bad news about their intended vote choice. And we see a sort of depressed turnout of 3.8 percentage points. Sort of marginally significant in some of these elections, but in the pool, so of 3.8 percentage points. So there's a little bit going on here, right? And then what we're really interested in, do they actually change their voting behavior? And so what we're focusing on here is sort of not voting for your intended vote choice, which could mean abstaining or it could mean voting for someone else. And what we see is that we see an increase, so our treatment group is 3.7 percentage points more likely not to vote for their intended vote choice. And this is true across the general elections, sort of significant in the 10% level. Then we restrict it to NRM voters in the general elections because that's what's comparable to the primaries. And then we don't have a significant treatment effect in the primaries, but sort of the magnitude of the effect is very consistent across these different elections. Right? So then we were also interested whether people sort of switched to the person who was coded as having performed best in the debate, and we don't really see much there. Maybe in the primaries where there are no barriers of partisanship, essentially, right? And then what we really care about is do people switch across parties? And what we see here is that the people who switched, sort of who they switched away from, it's really the NRM. So we see 5.2 percentage points of NRM voters switched away from their intended vote choice, and we see that they're going to the opposition, right? So we see a 2 percentage point increase in switching to the opposition. So what we're seeing here is really some voters who had been planning on voting for the NRM instead voting for the opposition. And some of them abstaining as well. So what are the factors here? So we think this is really driven by two factors. One is people had very high uncertainty about the opposition at baseline. And so we believe that, and they had sort of two negative priors about the opposition. So one, they updated positively, but second, they just sort of reduced their uncertainty, right? So if voters are risk averse, even if it's not about sort of shifting priors, just sort of reducing the uncertainty about how someone would perform were they to be elected might do a lot of the work here, right? And then what we also see is that this switching is really driven by voters whose preferred candidate lost in the primaries. So this might also have something to do then. So if I really wanted to vote for, I'm not going to use American examples, but if I really wanted to vote for a candidate and then they lost the primaries, right, then I'm more likely to switch away to the opposition. Well, what we also see, and this rhymes very well with what Eric just presented, is that even 6 to 8 weeks after the election, so much longer persistence of these effects, or of the treatment rather, we see that people are like candidates from the opposition more, right? So we see In the treatment group, we have a sort of overall, this intervention makes candidates more likable, but this is especially the case among members of the opposition. Okay. We can rule out a bunch of alternative explanations, such as social response bias, poor video performance by NRM candidates. What we were also really interested in, but we don't find any systematic evidence here, is sort of an idea that this isn't really about reducing uncertainty about the opposition, but what this might also be doing is it might sort of lead to a sort of shift in the perceived rules of the game, right? So if I'm a voter in a country where I've never seen my candidate side by side, right, on the same stage, and sort of there's a sense of animosity. And now for the first time, I'm actually seeing this nicely professionally produced video where all the different candidates, including the ones from the opposition party, are sitting not quite on the same stage, but it looks like they're sitting on the same stage, right? And this is sort of, you know, presented by the Electoral Commission. I might actually update and say, hey, maybe elections are becoming more fair. Maybe the playing field is actually becoming more level. But this is just a hunch. We can't provide systematic evidence for that. So all in all, we conclude that voters are sophisticated, and they update about candidate quality. So they're quite sophisticated in the way they're processing this information. They learn from the videos, and that even members of the ruling party in dominant party regimes can be swayed to cross party lines if given information about all candidates, in particular opposition candidates. And so what this suggests, that sort of from a policy perspective, what's really important here is providing information about all candidates. And that can actually level the playing field and increase political competition down the line. So I'll end here. Thank you.
Super. Thank you, Pia. Great. So we don't have a lot of time. But let me just pose a couple of questions just to start the conversation going and open it up then to the audience. First, Matt, I think the research shows, and many researchers who have worked in the area of debates have experienced or seen a reluctance of the incumbent as well as a reluctance of strong candidates to actually participate in debates. And so I wonder if you could talk about, from your observations globally, what have been some of the incentives and disincentives for candidates to participate or not?
You know, it's interesting, in working, helping people organize debates around the world, and countries are very different. I'd say the universal challenge of one thing that everybody faces, whether it's Nepal or Nebraska, is convincing candidates to debate. And it doesn't matter how big the country is or how small it is, everybody faces the same challenge. Starting from the negative, I'd say the reasons that you hear candidates say they won't debate is that there's a perception that if they're ahead, they're going to lose, they've got a lead in the polls, it's not worth risking. Some may feel like they're bad speakers or they're a bad debater. They don't want to lower their status by appearing next to a lesser candidate, quote unquote. If they're ahead, they fear they're going to get ganged up on during a debate, or they can't control the content, the message in a debate as you would in a rally. And it takes time to prepare. It takes time away from campaigning. Those are the disincentives. I think on the other side, generally challengers always want to debate, although that's not always true. In Nigeria, we just saw, for example, Atiku opted not to debate again because the incumbent, President Buhari, didn't debate, so he didn't want to go either. But it gives a candidate a rare chance to speak directly to voters. It's unfiltered by the media. For most candidates, it's the most media access that you will get in your political career. And a couple examples of that, in the US, debates are second only to the Super Bowl. So you may have 80 million people watch them, and only football beats that. In Argentina, actually debates even beat World Cup soccer finals, which, if you know Argentina, that's a lot. The other benefit is that debates will draw independent voters or people undecided, whereas they're not going to usually watch a campaign rally. It gives candidates a chance to react directly to attacks from their opponents on the spot. And for political parties, it's useful in that it allows them to showcase, I think, new talent, youth or women, that they're changing. They have a new image and a new voice. So I think those are some of the reasons that you see candidates debating.
So just to add to that, there's actually a new study from Liberia by my colleagues Horacio Larugui and Jeremy Bowles, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, which sort of runs counter to this intuition by candidates that maybe, and in particular incumbents, that it's not worth debating, because what they find is that conditional on participating in debates, they really bumped up their vote shares, the incumbents. So they had sort of variations, sort of how strongly they sort of arm twisted them to show up in the radio debates, and find that really benefited them.
Yeah, and they did have a number of prompts to get them to the debates in the first place. That's right. So Pia and Eric, I think the emerging evidence is pretty strong that debates increases the voters' knowledge and understanding of the political process and the candidates. And in both of your studies, we also see that candidate choice can be more fluid than we might have expected. Can you all talk about some of the conditions within the context that may support that fluidity within the broader democratic system?
Okay, I'll take a first stab at that one. So yeah, I think the really interesting result is kind of why are voters becoming, basically switching and maybe voting or being more open across party lines. The entire, or not the entire, but a large segment of the literature on American politics predicts exactly the opposite. Going back 3-4 decades, you have this idea that partisanship basically forms a perceptual lens through which people see the world. And so when you observe a debate, you expect potentially some partisan bias in how people interpret, and even who won the debate is kind of a partisan-laden type of question. So from the perspective of that literature, I think our results are a little bit kind of counter, or at least a little bit surprising. And so that raises the question, why is that the case? So one, I think, links to one of the points Pia made, which is just that a lot of times people don't know as much about out-party candidates, and they have pretty low expectations of them. Like their prior beliefs are guided pretty strongly by partisanship. And so often they're pleasantly surprised by what they see. But I don't think that's sufficient, because if there is partisan bias, that makes the likelihood of becoming pleasantly surprised by what you see much, much less likely. And so I think to some extent what we saw in Ghana is that the nature of partisan attachments are a little bit different. They're to some extent younger, and to some extent guided less by ideological positioning or by a kind of history of policy output. And so oftentimes people are strong supporters of a party, in part because that's what their community does, or that's how they were socialized. And so I think the likelihood of what we think of in the US as partisan motivated reasoning is less. We're less likely to see it in those conditions because of the way partisanship is structured. But that's a guess. We could do more research on this.
Yeah, right. So my sense in the Ugandan case is that there's a lot of voters who are undecided, really, but because there's such a strong default that you vote for the ruling party, and it might be tied to so many material benefits or sort of risk aversion, right, in the broadest sense, with regards to status, materials, safety, and so on, that these undecided voters might just then opt to vote for the ruling party. But then those are also exactly the kinds of voters who you can actually move away once you give them information that gives them a good rationale for actually voting differently. I also wanted to mention, so Kelly Bidwell is here, who's done the mother of the debate studies in Liberia, and they find very similar results, right? Yeah. In Sierra Leone, sorry, yeah.
Great. So We don't have a lot of time, and I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions, but quickly, Matt, from a practitioner perspective, seeing these results, also looking at the broader literature on experimental research and debates, what are some areas that you as a practitioner would like to see pursued for future research?
Well, I think several areas. One would be, it'd be interesting to find out this question of whether votes or debates change how people vote. In the United States, the research is pretty consistent that people will say the single most important factor in how I voted was the presidential debate I watched, and then they'll say, but it didn't change my decision on how to vote. It changed, it reinforced how I was going to vote. Also seen polling data in places like Jamaica where people said 30% of their of people changed how they were going to vote. That, in practical terms, would have had a huge impact on the outcome of the election. So it's hard to believe that that's accurate. So it'd be great to find out how that would work. It'd be great to find out more the impact on reducing polarization around elections. I think that would be helpful. Those would be two areas I'd flag.
I think I would maybe add, in terms of looking at the broader democratic system in new democracies, how are debates contributing to strengthening accountability or changing social norms? So with that, we don't have a lot of time, but I'd like to open it up to the audience if you have any questions. So I think the hand went up here first.
Well, following up on your first question, actually, Linda, but back to what Matt said about post-accountability debates, I'm just wondering what kind of incentives everyone or practitioners especially have seen for politicians to participate in follow-ups, like after they win. Why would an incumbent participate in a accountability debate?
So I think so it's a little bit, it's different, but a little bit similar to what gets candidates to participate in the debate in the first place, right? And so our experience was that it was very conducive to start from the top. So first of all, in how we designed these debates, sort of they already sort of gave us strong pointers saying, like, actually it was the NRM secretariat who said, everybody, all candidates have to participate, otherwise we're not part of this, we're out. It has to be about all candidates, and that's how this idea, actually, how this intervention came, right? So they can give a lot of pointers of sort of what's feasible, but then sort of having very strong buy-in from the top and then having them communicate at all the candidate training forums and so on. We expect the candidates who run from our party to participate. And then once you get a critical mass, it's very difficult to be the odd one out, right? And then we also communicated very clearly that, you know, if you don't show up, like, your name would be there as a no-show so that everybody knows.
At a quick point that one of the goals of our partner organization, CDD, in Ghana was to kind of do a version of the post-accountability debate without having to hold it. So they told the candidates kind of ahead of time, we're going to videotape this, we are going to create these videos, and if you get elected, we are going to be returning to your constituency to tell everyone and remind them what you said. So that is the next phase of this research, I hope.
It seems to me that the contexts you're describing, Eric and Pia in particular, are somewhat different. One of them is a very strong one-party regime. Another is a very competitive political system. In a strong one-party regime, if debates make supporters of the dominant party switch to the other party or not vote, so it reduces the legitimacy of the dominant party, why will the dominant party permit them to occur. Do you think they will continue to permit them in Uganda or other similar countries?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one we were really grappling with when we were scheduled to hold a big dissemination event in Kampala with all the leaders of the different parties, right? So we're like, I mean, we can't lie. We have to tell them what we found, right? But how are they going to respond? So we sort of talked to a lot of people in advance, but everybody was like, it's fine. Just tell them. It's going to be fine. And sort of their response, and this is a bit sad actually, their response was, they're not going to take your findings so seriously that it would change their. And so, but that doesn't quite answer it, right? Because then they might not find our plots terribly convincing, right? But once sort of if this were to take off, and then they realize themselves that this is actually not conducive, then how would they respond? And that's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I think there needs to be something in it for them, right? They still need to find it helpful.
I would just say from a practical perspective, that is a concern. I know anecdotally in a number of countries where the governing party doesn't like the debates. You've seen cases where if you partner with a state-run media outlet, which usually has the biggest reach, you run the risk that they'll pull the plug just before your debate. And in fact, we had a case in Central Europe where actually people organizing it were savvy, and they built 2 different debate sets, and they had one set up at a different station because they had a sense something might go wrong. Also seen cases, I think it was in Burundi, where the ruling party let it be known that they didn't want to see debates happen, and if they did, things could happen. Turned out to be an empty threat, but in an environment like that, it's worrisome. And I have also seen cases where governments will use regulatory bodies to make rulings that make debates illegal, or impossible. One case, they said, well, all the candidates have to agree to debate or you can't proceed. So that essentially gives any candidate veto power. And mysteriously enough, some candidates didn't want to take part, and so they couldn't host the debates as planned.
I'd like to know if there's a difference where in countries where voting is mandatory versus voting being elective in terms of the impact that debating has on that particular society. So do the constituents receive the information or integrate the information that they receive from the debates differently in communities where it's elective versus mandatory voting?
That's a great question. I can hypothesize, right? I don't know the answer, but I would guess that they might actually have more of an effect, right? Because the mandatory voting means that people who don't care about politics and might not be terribly informed still have to make some choice, right? But those are also the people, if you reach them with the debates, who might be the most easy to influence, right? So from that perspective, like I could imagine an argument why they might be even more effective.
Thanks. I'm wondering if there are any practical lessons from these 2 studies or from others about how to do this right in order to have an impact on improving voter choice. So from the studies, I get a sense that perhaps it makes sense to focus on the places that are contested, but I'm not sure if that's the right interpretation, or is it to focus specifically on the issues and perhaps not as much on the background? I'm wondering what you would say.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think some of our results have implications for dissemination. So we really didn't find any difference between video and audio, right? So that suggests that mass radio dissemination is likely to be equally influential as video, at least where we were working. So I think from a programmatic perspective, that's very useful. Some of the lessons that we learned kind of aren't even experimental. So one of the things that really came out just being on the ground was the importance of how these things are organized and the framework through which the candidates agree to participate, and basically the norms that arise over what is appropriate behavior in this debate. And there's a great example in KEA, one of our constituencies, where one of the candidates made what the other candidates felt was an inappropriate personal attack on the quality of their education, basically. And they actually stopped the debate, and there was a long discussion about why that was inappropriate, and he had to agree that he would stop making these personal attacks for them to agree to continue. So the tone of the debate was set by that moment. And so that suggested to me that norms around what's appropriate for candidates to be doing is really, really crucial, and that's the kind of stuff that I think Matt and his folks think about a lot. And then I think the third thing I would say is that given that we found some variation in the extent to which the effects were durable, I think we would want to think hard about how voters' social interactions and how their exposure to other sources of information and media might matter, and kind of think of them as existing in a kind of ecology and trying to understand how debates might be augmented to make them more kind of effective.
Yeah, just one comment and then one question and then a comment. On the Ghana study, I was a bit curious about your drawing a dichotomy between partisan polarization and moderation. And I was wondering whether there is a threshold, because these are political parties. So I would imagine the first assumption is that, people are drawn between two different parties. So do you have a threshold where partisan polarization becomes moderation? At what point do you determine that? On the Ugandan study, just using my experience of Uganda, Pierre, I was quite intrigued that you draw a very sharp dichotomy between ruling party and opposition in Uganda. Now, if you understand Uganda, I think it is fair enough to say that you don't have opposition parties because the ruling party is fused with government. Now, if the ruling party is fused with government, it means that any other political party is actually opposed to government. I would really want to understand, how you draw this distinction, because the police works for what you call the ruling party. The Electoral Commission, everybody knows, works for the ruling party. The local administration works for the ruling party. So at what point do we call these other parties opposition parties, and opposition to what? I don't know if you don't interrogate that relationship, whether the findings that you have from the study, which are quite interesting, remain valid. Yeah.
Right, let me respond to that. So no, I think you're exactly right that part of what sort of one of the defining criteria of dominant party regimes, right, is exactly this fusing between the state and the party. And so that means that voting for the opposition can actually feel very risky, right? Because it's the unknown. If the opposition were to win, what would happen? Would the government actually, sort of the ruling party, would they actually hand over power? Would there be a peaceful transition of power? What would happen, right? And so I think that's part of sort of what's underlying our results is precisely that you have this very unlevel playing field between the ruling party and the opposition parties. And so voters have a lot of uncertainty about them, in part because they don't have good information about the opposition parties, but in part because it's so unknown what would happen if they were to win, right? That's part of the underlying uncertainty. But I think that's exactly why we might be seeing these large treatment effects, right?
Yes, thank you. That is a really helpful question. So, I mean, the way we were talking about moderation here is more about movement as opposed to a static thing with a threshold. But your point is still well taken, right? Because we could see movement and still have a very polarized society, right? And so one of the things we do, which I didn't show, was we look to see whether the debates shift people into positive evaluations, rather going from like horrible to kind of horrible, right? And they actually do. Like, you see people, it's not just that they're moving from 1 out of 7 to 2 out of 7. Many people are moving into the positive side of the scale. And so that, I think, is some indication that it's substantively reducing polarization as opposed to just making the polarization slightly less extreme.
Great. I think we need to, I'm getting this sign, cut it off since we will be eating into the next panel. But thank you all so much. This is very interesting, and I think it's a lot to mull on, and we could talk for a long time, but you've given us lots of great ideas and food for thought. Thank you.